since we're in such a beautiful, beautiful place, I want to acknowledge the land that we're on. This land, for thousands of years, was land that the first peoples of this place congregated on, lived their spiritual lives on, and lived in harmony with the land and the sea and the air. And we acknowledge that we stand here as settlers on this land. And we're in a process of walking through the journey of reconciliation as a community with First Nations peoples. I want to thank especially the Songhees Nation for the amazing openness and graciousness they have had in walking with the Anglican Church through this process. We are still in a time of learning as a community, but we do know that this area was near a village center, actually. This was an area that was very important for cultural traditions, for trade, for the harvesting of blue camas. And we continue to learn about the history of this land, the history of the peoples who first lived on this land, and to seek ways that we can walk together in a new way. So I just want to acknowledge that and give thanks for the thousands of years that people were caretakers of this land that we so deeply appreciate now. I also want to start out with a prayer, just to start us in a good place with a sense of gratitude and appreciation. Holy One, we give thanks for our many blessings, for the beauty of this place, for all the people of the world and the unique gifts that they are bringing to help us combat the ecological crisis, to help us ensure that this beautiful earth is here not just for us, but for our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. We give thanks for all of those individuals who are working so hard to ensure that the beauty that we appreciate can be beheld by the generations to come. We ask for you to be present to us during this time, to help us have ears to hear, and to help send us out into the world so that we can be good caretakers of this beautiful creation. Amen. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Rick Kool. He's Professor of Environment and Sustainability at Royal Roads University. I'm going to actually read his bio because it's one of the best bios that I've seen. It's delightful. So I'm just going to read it to you. Rick Kool is the founder of the MA in Environmental Education and Communication at Royal Roads. He has published on the walking speed of dinosaurs, Northwest Coast native whaling, museum exhibit design, ciliated protozoan development, and the sex life of marine invertebrates. His current work relates to environmental education and how it confronts hope and despair, the potential role and place of religion and environmental education, and conceptions of change and environmental education and communication. He is also active with the Victoria Holocaust Remembrance and Education Society and is the past president, and he also plays the string bass. Maybe we'll have you back with a reprieve with your string bass, I don't know. This evening, he is going to use analysis developed by the Norwegian peace scholar, is it Johan Galtung? And he'll examine 3 ways that we are engaged in and help to facilitate environmental violence, and 3 approaches to reduce the environmental violence that we are all individually and communally complicit in. So without further ado, I welcome Dr. Kool. Thank you.
Thank you. And I've got this fancy gadget here, and I'm really happy to be here. I'm happy to come into any house of worship. I'm part of the Congregation Emmanuel. I'm the director of the cemetery. We have this beautiful historic cemetery on the top of Fernwood Hill. It wasn't a job description I was really looking to have. You know, I didn't dream when I was younger about being the director of a historic Jewish cemetery, but sometimes life gives you funny jobs to do. I've never spoken at this church. A few years ago, I was invited to speak at the end of December, the last sermon of the year at Christ Church Cathedral downtown. It was a very interesting experience, speaking in a stone building. I'm a Bostonian, and I tend to speak quickly, and in a stone building, you have to speak slowly and appreciate periods. And it was great. And just to briefly tell you, I was talking about where we were in our liturgical cycle, which was the beginning of the book of Exodus. And I contrasted Stephen Harper with Pharaoh. It was a really interesting conversation we had afterwards. Anyways, so is this going to work? And given the place we're speaking, I thought I'd bring something from C.S. Lewis, because a student I taught at UVic before I was at Royal Roads, I was teaching first-year biology at UVic, and this kind of fabulous young woman in my class gave me his book, Mere Christianity. Now, I'm not a Christian, but this book was really remarkable. And I don't know if you've ever read this piece, but this is where we are, I think. This is the kind of concern we have, because we're all about progress. But if you've taken a wrong turn, going forward doesn't get you any closer to where you want to be. And as he says, in that case, the man who turns back soonest is the most progressive man. And I think this is the question we're facing. Have we taken a wrong turn? Do we see ourselves getting any closer to the destination we'd like to get to? And in fact, are we really now seriously talking about how do we turn around? So I really love this. Okay, so I want to talk about violence. And I want you to just first to think a bit about, because I'm going to show you maybe even some disturbing images of violence. So, like this. Is this violence? You know, BBC, taken months to get that image. We're saying nature. We wouldn't consider this. It's violent, right? But we don't see it as violence as we might understand it. Okay, but I want to show you another one. Okay, now you may remember this. is it violent, right? Is it different from the lion hunting the little baby zebra? Again, the question of what violence is there a difference between this? And I'm just asking this rhetorically. We can talk about it later. But is there a difference between the lion hunting and this, what you could call in this movie in 2001, the Space Odyssey, a proto-human, becoming human? But what about this? Is this violence? Right? Is this violence? Or, forgetting about that, this is in Mongolia. This is a river where they mine, where they mine rare earth metals, which we're hearing a lot about now. So, as was said earlier, my background is in environmental education. That's what I started a master's program at Royal Roads about that. And the world that I come out of in this environmental education world, which grew out of conservation education, which really formalized itself in the 1970s, talked about this idea of sick and tired of misdevelopment of America that diminishes daily the quality of the human experience. This misdevelopment of decreasing beauty, increasing contamination. We've had years and decades of work since Clay Schoenfeld wrote this in 71, but the word violence actually in this field never shows up. It doesn't show up in any of the environmental stuff. Big conferences we've had, declarations, but there's never a mention of violence. So I've tried to bring this conversation to my colleagues and to students and teachers, practitioners, that I think we're missing something if when we talk about human impact on the world, we don't use these concepts of what violence is. Now, one of my kind of philosophical heroes is the French Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas. And I love this definition that for him, violence is any action in which one acts as if one were alone to act. That is, there was nothing else in the world and we could do whatever we want. That the rest of the universe is there only to receive our action. Sadly, I think about the President of the United States in these kinds of terms. That violence, another person taking Levinas's ideas, is when we are completely self-centered and the world is there for us to take things from, exploit, and dump things into. That's violence. That is, in a way, our cultural history in North America of coming in as settlers, as Elizabeth said, and then moving westward, leaving destruction behind us, moving into new territory. I was a teacher for a while in Ucluelet on the west coast of the island in the 70s. And I really had interesting conversations with the loggers who were the parents of my students. And they walked every day into this beautiful green world. And then they took it apart. But every day they saw this beautiful green world which they dismantled. So one way of thinking about violence, the self-centered human part of violence, that ignoring other people, other creatures, and the rest of the world. But the fellow I'd like to present to you is, as Elizabeth said, is this fellow Johan Galtung. And he's considered by people who work in this domain, and this is a domain I've had to come into, really the guy who started what's called peace studies. A lot of his stuff is available online. Obviously a Scandinavian guy. I don't agree with everything he does and everything he wrote, but he's provided some very interesting frameworks for thinking about things. And he talks about violence in this way, that it's an avoidable insult. That is, it's not necessary that we do these things, they're avoidable. They're an insult to basic human needs, and then he expanded it to, say, more generally, to sentient life of any kind. That's a pretty big category, sentient life of any kind. I'm a total fan of dragonflies, and I have a sense that they know what's going on around them also. But his point here is that violence lowers the ability of people, let's say people, to satisfy their needs. So he focuses on the satisfaction of things we need, like survival, is one of our needs. We want to survive. And violence negates that possibility, right? Violence negates the possibility of us being well. That violence causes us to live in misery. That violence negates the possibility of us expressing our freedom. And the negation of that is repression. Now, we, coming out of a Western tradition, really value this, especially freedom. And I can tell you, I teach in China every 2 years. We have a master's program in China, and I go to China every 2 years. I live there for about 6 weeks, and I teach a course to the Chinese graduate students on leadership and sustainable development. To teach a leadership course in a dictatorship is very strange. And it's, I read about, I'm involved with Holocaust stuff. My family was hugely impacted by that. But freedom and repression, and that maybe that's just our idea. But for Galtung, violence negates the possibility of freedom. And I'm increasingly aware when I go into dictatorships that repression is violence. And we have needs to establish our own sense of meaning in the world and our own personal identity. And violence can negate that and make us feel alienated from ourselves and alienated from the world. So when he talks about need satisfaction, these are kind of basic needs. Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is the bottom level, in a sense, surviving and being healthy. And violence affects our ability to meet those basic human needs, according to Galtung. Now, who does violence? Well, Galtung would say anyone can cause direct violence. I could come up and punch you, right? Direct violence. And we can all be perpetrators. We can all be actors who cause direct violence. But what Galtung, I think what attracted me to his analysis was he talked about not just the direct physical violence that can limit my wellness, limit my survival, limit my ability to be who I am. But he talks about this other thing called structural violence. And this is his quote, a structure or system at work, churning, isn't that a great phrase? Churning out harm, causing basic human needs deficits. It's not intended. The people who create these systems don't mean for violence to occur, but the system causes violence to occur. Unintended, indirect, structural violence. And so we have systems that are violent systems, and then we legitimize those systems through what he would call cultural violence. So he says you can look at it this way. You can look at it as being there's violence that's visible, and that's the direct violence. We see the punch. We see the hit with a baton and often that's what we focus on. And a lot of environmental discourse has been about the direct violence, the pollution, the litter, the smoke coming out of the stacks. We can see this, and we focus on this. What we don't often see is what's below the surface, which is this relationship between structural and cultural violence, and how all of this direct violence is driven, in a sense, by these other forms of violence. So it's all relational. The direct violence is justified by cultural violence, and sometimes is necessitated through the way we structure our systems, our society. So, while we understand the direct violence, personal violence, Galtung has a bunch of these kinds of things about, as I mentioned, alienation, desocialization, but non-human nature also is affected by direct violence. That is, we destroy entire biotas. You may have seen or heard about in the news last week, the journal Science published a big study that indicating that perhaps 3 billion birds have been lost over the last, like 40 or 50 years. That is, the bird biomass of North America has shrunk dramatically. One of my colleagues is working on with insects. I don't know. I remember when I was young, you drive your car around, you end up in the summertime with insects splattered all over, and it doesn't happen anymore because the neonicotinoids and other pesticides and just simple reduction of habitat have reduced insect populations. So we destroy not only biota, but we can, in direct form of violence, we destroy entire ecosystems. That's direct violence. Those loggers coming out of my town when I used to live out in Ucluelet, they were destroying entire watershed valleys. And we get this idea of direct violence, whether it's a whaling, these little pilot whales being cordoned into beaches, and I think this is maybe in Iceland. These large-scale deforestations that happen, whether it's in British Columbia or whether it's in the Amazon. That's tuna, and we don't think about how much it takes to actually provide us with these cans of tuna fish that are on our shelves. And that's a whole other talk I could give about Vancouver Island is not really an island because we have no sense of ourselves as an island needing all sorts of stuff. Or these trophy hunters who went out and shot that famous lion. That's direct violence, Galtung would say, is the outcome of an actor with an intent to commit violence. As these guys are out there intending to kill whales, to clear-cut forests, to pull thousands of tuna out of the ocean, or whatever. That's the obvious stuff. It's the simple stuff. It's the stuff that we get all cranked up about. But I think what we need to be aware of is this stuff, is the structural violence, the indirect and unintentional violence that we're all complicit in some ways. So maybe you know about this area between Baton Rouge and New Orleans in Louisiana. It's called Cancer Alley. No one gets old there. Everyone dies of cancer. Each of those dots is a significant petrochemical plant, pesticide plant. This is the Mississippi River, I think, going down towards New Orleans. Cancer Alley, that's what it's called. It's not intended. No one who makes a petrochemical plant is planning on giving cancer to thousands and tens of thousands of people. It's just the nature of the system. Here, each of those, you can't read them from your distance, but, these are here's Shell, and so here's Chevron, right? So they all have plants. These are the chemicals, ethyl glycol ethers, ethane, isopropylamine, methanol, and the size of the text is related to the quantity of materials produced. But you can see, from up here in Baton Rouge down to New Orleans, this is just the chemical heartland of the American South.
Well, we have new information tonight that could have a major impact on our investigation into toxic air pollution in St. John the Baptist Parish.
David Hammer has been investigating the high risk of cancer there in our series called The Toxic Truth. He joins us now with new information. And David, what have you found?
Well, Karen and Natalie, it was shocking when we discovered that neighborhoods around a chemical plant in St. John the Baptist Parish had the highest cancer risk in the country. But there was no record of actual cancer rates in those neighborhoods until now. A new state law forced the Louisiana Tumor Registry to start counting cancer cases at the neighborhood level, and that data just became available. As you'll see tonight at 10, environmentalists like Tulane University professor Oliver Hauk believe the new cancer numbers will force the state to take action.
State agencies are going to have to regulate, and the health department, which has been in denial forever, right, is now beyond denial. It's the data. Data makes it apparently. It's a health problem.
But not so fast. The state health officer is not convinced the chemical plant is what's causing the higher cancer rates. And we will break down the data and all the arguments about what it means tonight at 10 on Channel 4 and on WWLTV.com.
So important for our community. Looking forward to that report. Thank you, David.
Well, this Cancer Alley thing, the state health authorities have known this for I first learned about Cancer Alley in 1996, right? So this isn't new stuff. I mean, this is, there were 3 places in the U.S. that were particularly affected in this way. Hanford, Washington, just west of here, right? Lots and lots of cancers because of the nuclear waste facility there. The San Joaquin Valley in California, pesticide pollution, and Cancer Alley in New Orleans. But none of these places are designed to hurt people or to hurt nature. But the structure of our economic and social systems, well, just happens. So again, Galtung talks about, this direct violence, visible as an action, but violence that doesn't have a clear subject-object relation is structural. It's built into structure. So Cancer Alley, there's no intent. And this is, again, a quote that he uses. When one husband beats his wife, that's direct violence. But when 1 million husbands keep 1 million wives in ignorance, that's about structure of society. That's structural violence. Where in a society where life expectancy for the rich people is far in excess of life expectancy for poor people, it's not like the rich people are out to hurt poor people. It's a structural problem. And those problems are often kept hidden from us. In fact, I've always felt that one of the tasks of a teacher, and I think we're all teachers as adults, we're all teachers. Teachers part of our obligation is to reveal things that are hidden, at the same time being open to revelation oneself. And so structures are hidden, and we don't have a lot of pixie dust to sprinkle on them and to make them visible. Again, here, he talks about, 18th century, person died from tuberculosis. That's not violence. But what happened in Canadian residential schools and with the Inuit, where we had lots of abilities to treat things like tuberculosis, he would consider that to be violence. The ozone hole. Again, no one intends, Galtung points out, no one intends to destroy nature, in quotes, nature. But what we do and what we allow to be done in the name of progress, going back to C.S. Lewis, did things like creating this ozone-depleting substances and thus a risk to not just humans, but all life, all biota, through things like the ozone hole. This is structural violence. Climate change is a form of structural violence. It's not intended. And we're engaged with this. Like, people I know have run these oil sands education programs, giving teachers free experiences up in the tar sands. And who's sponsoring it? But these very large companies. These companies, which, in fact, I think you'd have to say are violent companies, right? Now, that's not to say that the CEO of these companies are violent people, but the structural violence of the oil sands project is affecting not just humans downstream and elsewhere, but biota downstream as well. I mean, these companies don't see themselves as being violent. They're responsible developers of one of Canada's most valuable resources, the oil sands. But the structure is a problem. And these structures are excused in our world through what Galtung calls cultural violence. The symbolic sphere of our existence. Religions can be used to justify or legitimize direct or structural violence. And so we have to find ways to, make this violence visual. I mean, science was used to be very violent. You've got, eugenic science. There's the perfect, skull on the top. The Greek profile. The Negro skull really tied to the chimpanzee skull. Science has been, here on Vancouver Island. What was it, 3 or 4 years ago? The graduate student back at Guelph found the medical experiments that were being done in residential schools. It's really new research, finding in the records that here at the Alberni Residential School, children were being starved and malnourished as part of a formal science study sponsored by the Canadian government with doctors and dentists and nurses and dietitians, doing experiments. And the rubric of science, and that's a robe I wear as a scientist, was culturally justifying violence against children, really, children. Is this a form of cultural violence? When we talk about sustainable economic growth at the World Economic Forum, right? There is no such thing as endless growth. The young Norwegian woman talked about it being a fairy tale. I mean, she really nailed that one, right? It is sort of a fairy tale. Well, not just sort of, it's a fairy tale. So our leaders, the stock markets, these are all forms of cultural violence. They justify the structures that lead to direct violence. So I was just telling Elizabeth my latest little project. Okay, so this is just, I'm blowing my own horn just a little bit because every morning for the last week, I just wake up with this smile on my face. So I've been working since March to try to find a news media outlet that will put carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere in the stock market report. Because the carbon dioxide problem we're having, the climate change problem, is a failure of the market economy. The market predicts that everything will be properly valued, and clearly we haven't done that. So it's not an the outcome is an environmental problem, but CO2 in the atmosphere is an economic issue. So last Tuesday, with the climate strike thing happening, I finally convinced Gregor Craigie to put me on the radio at 7:50 at CBC Victoria. And I made my case for it. A lot of people, and we've talked before, Gregor and I, about this. And Thursday morning at 6:50, when Gregor Craigie reads the market report, the last thing he said after he talks about the price of 1,000 board feet of lumber, and now he's saying, and the CO2 level in the atmosphere is 408.63. That's up from last year this day when it was 405.27. So I want to link the market with the CO2 levels, because when the markets are up, in truth, the environment is down. And the rate at which, when we had the recession in 2008, the rate of CO2 being produced went down. So the market is our church, really. It's our culture's church. And we have to confront this. Isaiah, in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah at one point talks about confronting the lie that's in our right hand, the power, the hand you hold your sword in, and growth, and this endless fairy tale, as our Swedish friend said. That's the lie in our right hand, and that's something we have to confront. Galtung points out that cultural violence makes the other kinds of violences look and feel right, or at least not wrong. It changes the emotional valence from red or wrong to green or right. So I'm trying to get to the National Post and the Globe and Mail. And I have also a connection with the New York Times. Because if you look at your morning paper, like if you read one of the two national papers, on the business section, there's usually a little box or something, and it has if the stock market is up, like the TSX is up, there's a little triangle surrounded by a box, and it's green. And when the market is down, is a little box and it's red. So green is good, up is good, red is bad, down is bad, except for CO2. Because when CO2 is up, it's red, right? And so the cultural violence changes the emotional valence, and I think we have to change some of that emotional valence. You know, Galtung points out that what's wrong is killing in your own name, but it's okay to kill in the name of your country. We change the valence of this. You know, and our culture, right? This was just to add in the paper, you know, it's going to be we're all in this together. And it's exactly true. We are all in this together. We're all in the structures and we're all a part of a culture. And, you know, what it says you may argue with, but we are all in this together. And that's the work that I think we all have to do, is how to change this all together. Now, as I began to just playing around, you know, I find these weird little features that are on here. So I'm interested in environmental education, of course, but that's not the point of all this. I want to talk about three things to wrap this up. You can imagine, you know what nonviolence is, you know, from Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi. We understand this concept of environmental nonviolence. But I've had to make up two words. One of the words I had to make up is anti-violence, and the other, even weirder word I had to make up was contra-violence. And I'd like to go through these. This is what I think we can be engaged in, individually and even more powerfully collectively. So environmental nonviolence is, is the kind of stuff we do that is not violent. For example, you know, don't pour your oil into the drains like we used to do. Or, you know, don't buy fish that is being mined. It's like orange roughy. The fish populations of the planet are crashing in the open ocean. You know, or like I live in James Bay. I work at Royal Roads this morning. I mean, like every day, I ride my bicycle out to Royal Roads. It's a 30-kilometer round trip. Good for my mental health, good for my physical health, and I can at least look at my students, and I confess, yes, I do get on airplanes, but my commute to work is, relatively speaking, I mean, I have nonviolent. I have a bowl of oatmeal in the morning or something. But bicycle riding is a form of environmental nonviolence. And we can find things, you know, whether it's eating less meat, or whether it's, you know, using less stuff, or being conscious about a range of things. You know, we can do things that are nonviolent, environmental nonviolent. We can walk, transit, we can be much more active, we can eat lower on the food chain, or at least reduce reduce the amount of high-level stuff like animal-based protein. We can simply use less stuff. You know, keeping things running, you know, I didn't put it in here. I have a poster, a Second World War Canadian propaganda poster. And I found it in the National Archives. So it's a horizontal orientation, and across the top, now this is wartime. Across the top it says, "Fight this army of saboteurs." Serious language in wartime. And who are the saboteurs? They're these little cartoon figures of hoarders, wasters, rubber users, moths, rust, breakage. And then across the bottom it says, "Take care of what you have." So it's wartime. We're not there. When the Twin Towers fell in New York City, George Bush didn't tell people, take care of what you have. He told people, go out and shop. Right? These are all things that we can do that are environmentally nonviolent. But anti-violence is different, because it's likely anti-violence is not something necessarily we do alone. It's something we do with others. So the youth climate strike stuff is a form of working politically against, that's the anti, working against the violence, the structural and cultural violence that we're all complicit in, that we just to live in our society puts us in complicit relationship with this violence. Okay, so there we are. We're complicit, but now what are we going to do? So we come together with others We come together with others to be involved politically. And I don't see that this is a problem. This should be a problem for teachers in schools. It's not that you're necessarily pitching something, one way of understanding the world. But the point is, civics, which is what I would have taken in high school, has kind of disappeared. And civics teaches you how to engage politically. And in our society, a lot of the anti-violent activity is how we come together to deal with politics. And of course, I think, given where we are here, I think we have to recognize that Elizabeth May, whether you like her or not, she's a really important person in this transition, this movement around anti-violence. I don't agree with everything about Elizabeth, but when I first met her, I was on a panel with her. In fact, I was on a couple of panels, and one of them was in Christchurch Cathedral, and I started donating to the Green Party just because, and I'm an NDP guy, because she is a voice that I think is very important for us right now. And we can do things. So, like, this is one of my students, the guy here, one of my grad students, and he organized his neighborhood in the Danforth in Toronto to build rain gardens. So all these people rather than having the runoff water go from rain going into the storm sewers, they basically kept it in these structures that keep the water in the ground. And this green neighborhood in downtown Toronto, that they're engaged in active citizenship. That's what we need. They're engaged with community organizing and awareness building. That's anti-violent activity. They are engaged in civil actions, doing this kind of stuff, maybe getting out and going to a demonstration or organizing a demonstration to let others know that they're not alone. Because I think one of the most difficult things is thinking in the face of a problem that we're all alone. That's that form of violence that Galtung talks about, that alienation that violence causes us to not see ourselves working with others. So I think there's nonviolent things. Maybe some of you drove here in an electric car, relatively nonviolent compared to burning fossil fuels. I didn't bike out here today. I did drive in my electric car because I've already done my 30 kilometers today, and I really thought about it, but I got home late, and I did with the dog, and anyways. So, and then the other thing that we can do, I think, and while I think your church as a community can involve themselves in nonviolent behaviors and in anti-violent behaviors, I think one of the most interesting ones is the contra-violent, what I'm calling contra-violence. And I had to make this term up. But contra refers to going against or the opposite of something. And so environmental contra-violence is how do we undo the damage that we're all complicit in, that we're all part of, that there's no way in our society we cannot be part of it. And I think one of the wonderful and primary things we could all do, especially here in southern Vancouver Island, is to get involved in ecological restoration projects. So I'm on the board, for example, of the Habitat Acquisition Trust, HAT, and that's what we do. We help people put covenants on land to protect that land, to assist in the restoration of damaged ecosystems, and we can do this. The restoration is restoration is a beautiful concept. It's a religious concept, isn't it? We talk about that. In my world, in the Jewish world, we have this phrase tikkun olam, which means the healing, or really the restoration of a broken world. The rabbis tell us we don't have to solve all of the problems of the world. In a book called The Wisdom of the Elders, Pirkei Avot, one of the rabbis says, you're not obligated to complete the task, but neither are you free to desist from it. You don't have to solve every problem, but we should all be part of the solution. And so ecological restoration allows us to do it, whether it's planting eelgrass or engaging in planting, this is a coral reef stuff, planting eelgrass that Nikki Wright, some of you may know Nikki here with Sea Something Society. Nikki is this amazing woman who's done all this great work on restoration of eelgrass beds. There's all sorts of ways we can work to restore damage, to undo the damage. One of the coolest things is Interstate 35 in the United States. The monarch butterflies essentially follow the route of Highway 35. And a number of organizations and state governments have come together to create the Monarch Highway, where they're planting monarch-friendly vegetation along this highway corridor to help the monarchs do this multi-general migration north and south. And there are issues with it, but the idea is really a beautiful one, right? It's highway ministries or departments in the U.S. thinking about the monarchs and about their real estate and saying, yeah, we've caused problems, but this is a little, I'm sorry, right? We can do something. And by planting, the appropriate vegetation, the monarch larvae are happy, even though trucks are zipping past, and maybe this will help the monarchs to more than survive, but even thrive. And and there's research being done because they're finding that highway noise actually stresses the larvae. So the highway may not be the best place, but it is a place, and it's better than nothing. That's for sure. This was just published a short while ago in the Transactions of the Royal Society of London. Eric Higgs, maybe some of you know Eric, he's a professor at UVic, was the chair of the School of Environmental Studies, a really, really wonderful guy. It's a really marginally published paper. No one knows about this. But this was a paper he wrote a long time ago that I loved, a quantity of engaging work to be done. Right here in Cadbro Bay, there's a quantity of engaging work to be done. And you can get your young people from the church to be involved in this and from the local schools to do this work of ecological restoration. Because this ultimately, I think, is spiritual work. The Lummi First Nations, which are down in the U.S. side of the Salish Sea, they're feeling compelled to try to feed these endangered southern orcas that are starving to death. This idea of contra-violence, working against environmental violence, is applicable to all of the Abrahamic faiths at the least, whether it's through the Quran teaching. Larry Troster writes about Tikkun Olam and Jewish eco-theology. Gretel Van Vieren did her doctorate at Yale, and she's done a lot of work on, this book is called, this is her dissertation turned into a book, Restored to Earth, Christianity, Environmental Ethics, and Ecological Restoration. She's a great writer and a great Christian thinker, and I think there's a lot of this coming out now. And so we can do this. This is all stuff that's doable. We can reduce our violence. We can come together to work politically to reduce our environmental violence, and we can try to undo the violence that we're all complicit in. So I'd just like to finish up with just a couple more, if that's okay. You're all familiar with Martin Luther King. He wrote, this is kind of an incredible statement. We're confronted with the fierce urgency of now. And he says, there is such a thing as being too late. We may cry out desperately for time to pause in our passage, but time is deaf to every plea and rushes on. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residue of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late. And I think many of us are coming to this understanding. The scientific world has been talking about this for 30 years. When is it going to be too late? There's a lot of work to be done. And as educators, and I've said we're all educators, despair isn't our business, right? But our business is to get on with what needs to be done. So one of my dearest friends started this hashtag called Ocean Optimism. This comes out of the Smithsonian, SI, and my friend Ellen, there she is, she's quite an extraordinary person. Sometimes I think, oh, Ellen, you are such a Pollyanna. On the other hand, we need people like Ellen to keep us realizing that because it's really easy to sink into miserableness. And Ellen, just look at her face. That's really who she is. That we can do things. We have to do things. It's our obligation to do things. And there's no way we can not feel that we have this responsibility. So, just to literally finish, I think we need words to describe what we see. And what we see in the environmental situation is direct environmental violence. We can begin to understand the structures that cause this violence, and we can look at those aspects of our culture that justify the structures. And I think we can respond with nonviolence. We can engage collectively, especially right now during an election campaign, with anti-violent work. And that big demonstration a few days ago at the legislature was a wonderful form of anti-violence. And we can do the little bit of work that helps to undo things. So I hope that, as a teacher, I'm interested in trying to reveal things that are hidden. I hope that you'll maybe now reveal some things that I haven't seen yet. And thank you very much for the opportunity today. Yeah.